points of, I hope this isn't too academic and boring or geeky, but I think it's definitions and clarifications around some terminology and issues in this are actually very important, particularly as we're probably heading quite soon towards an election campaign, and we will hear politicians banding around some claims and terms. Firstly, inequality is not the same as poverty. They are different things. Inequality is about there's different ways of measuring it, but is about the gap between the top and the bottom, essentially, whereas poverty is about income levels at the bottom. So they are different, although they're often used almost synonymously or in the same breath. And in understanding the drivers of the rise in inequality in the UK since the 1970s, it's been driven by different things at different times. So initially with deindustrialisation, it was driven by a hollowing out of middle income, mainly manual jobs, to do with automation in manufacturing and so on. More recently, it's been driven by very strong or stronger earnings growth at the top, an emergence of very high income earners. And since the global financial crisis in particular and austerity, it's been driven by cuts to benefits at the bottom end. It's been also driven by cuts to benefit levels and eligibility. So there are different things that have driven at different times, have dominated in driving up inequality. Another term that we often see used a lot by politicians in particular is social mobility. And again, social mobility does not equate with equality necessarily. I'm not saying social mobility isn't a desirable thing. We all want to live in a meritocracy. But the wage distribution is perhaps largely a structural issue to do with labour market regulation, behaviour of firms and of the tax and benefit systems. So you can have all the social mobility that you like, people moving up and down in relation to their parents' incomes, and that may not necessarily, if you've got people moving down and up, that's not necessarily going to change the income distribution in any way, unless we can have more people moving up than moving down. So I think the term social mobility is sometimes sort of underpinned by assumptions that we can all be middle class, that everyone's going to move up, which sort of raises the question of who's going to sweep the streets and empty the bins and so on. So social mobility, of course, is a desirable thing, but on its own, it's not going to necessarily solve issues of inequality. Another thing that politicians often band around is raising particularly the lowest tax threshold where you start paying income tax, saying we've taken X hundred of thousands or even into the millions of people out of paying tax. It's not a particularly progressive way of reducing tax because everyone benefits that earns from the tax threshold and up, including the very highest earners. So it's a very blunt and expensive way of trying to tackle inequality. The last point and definitional point I wanted to make in sort of making sense of inequality in the economy is that pay rates are not the same thing as earnings. So we've got national minimum wage or national living wage, which is an hourly rate, and that's a good thing. But we've seen, since the global financial crisis, we've seen a big rise in underemployment as opposed to unemployment. That is people working fewer hours than they want, 0 hours contracts and so on. So take-home pay, take-home earnings are, of course, a function of your hourly rate and how many hours you can work. So underemployment has become, it has fallen because of labour shortages in very recent years, but it had become a rather ingrained feature of the UK labour market. So those are some definitions and clarifications that I think are worth thinking about. What could be done to help tackle some of these issues? One, cutting tax thresholds would help generate more revenue at a time of public spending deficit. It would be a relatively ubiquitous way to increase tax, but people at the bottom would, of course, need to be compensated. So I would be in favour of reintroduction of something like the tax credits system that topped up incomes for low earners. And those are the main thoughts that I have. I'll keep some powder dry for the questions later.
Thank you very much, Donald. I think the very important point that we do have choices here. The examples of other countries suggest that there are very many different ways to approach this question. And next up, I'm going to come to Alex Beer. Alex, my former colleague at the Department of Work and Pensions. I won't embarrass Alex by saying just how long ago we worked together. And now head of welfare at the Nuffield Foundation and responsible for commissioning quite a wide range of projects across a whole number of areas, covering not just welfare but other aspects of tax benefit and the economy in general. So Alex is extremely well positioned, I think, to present a sort of overview of what the recent research, policy-related research has to say in this area. Alex.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And it was just a couple of years ago, as I'm sure you'll all guess, that we worked together. And I should just correct, in case my colleague Mark is watching, I am sort of very, very closely aligned with the welfare team at the Nuffield Foundation, but that's led by Mark Franks, and I am head of our portfolio development. But I have a sort of long background in our welfare projects and have been very closely associated with many of those on which I'm going to draw today. So particularly the IFS Deep Review of Inequalities, the Economy 2030 inquiry that was led by the Resolution Foundation and the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, and also another couple of projects led by Ruth Patrick, but involving sort of large cross-university teams and the Child Poverty Action Group, and those are the Benefit Changes and Larger Families project, and also COVID realities. So I just want to thank all of those and more who have contributed to sort of shaping my thinking in the words I'm going to share with you today. So thinking about what reforms to the benefits system could help with the problems of high levels of inequality, low levels of social mobility, increasing levels of poverty and deprivation. I think that I wondered sort of which way do I approach the question? So we've got one way of looking at it is which reforms to the benefit system might respond to those high levels of inequality and increasing levels of poverty and deprivation. And then there's another sort of slightly different way of looking at it, which are what are the wider system changes that are needed that reduce reliance on the benefit system. Because as the IFS Deep Review of Inequalities says in its report on benefits, much of the benefit system is actually a system of patches applied to problems that we've not found better ways of addressing, such as low pay, ill health, and high housing costs. So I'll start with what the benefit system can do, then how you might reform it or reduce reliance on it, and then I'll quickly touch on housing and health before reflecting a little bit on dignity. So firstly, what the benefit system can do. I mean, it's a hugely powerful system in its ability to redistribute income. So, for example, between 1994 and 1995 and 2019 and 2020, in-work benefits managed to offset the increases in earnings inequality among households with someone in work. So what you saw was that earnings at the 10th percentile grew by 0.6% a year, compared with 1.2% at the median, and higher still at the 90th percentile. But once you take account of the tax and benefit system and the set of in-work benefits we had, that completely offset the increase in earnings equality. So Donald was talking earlier about sort of, inequality has been driven by different things at different times. And so you can see the benefit system is a powerful tool in response to increasing earnings inequality. Benefits can also alleviate poverty and deprivation. And although I'm primarily going to focus on benefits to working age and children, we've seen that changes to the state pension and other pensioner benefits and their uprating, made huge inroads to reducing pensioner poverty. You saw during COVID, the increases to benefits, including the temporary uplift to universal credit, provided support during COVID and helped to protect the incomes of the lowest income fifth of the population. So they're a vital route to get money to families on low incomes. But conversely, when benefits are reduced in real terms, the impacts are severe. So, for much of the 2010s, support for families in the social security system did not keep pace with the rising cost of living. Benefit cuts, notably the benefit cap and the two-child limit, are showing up in increased levels of child poverty in families with 3 or more children. So by 1920, almost half of families with 3 or more children were in poverty, up from 33% in 2012-13. And I was mentioning the sort of uplifts within the benefit system during COVID. That wasn't available to those whose benefits were already capped or who weren't on universal credit, for example. So those types of sort of cuts or the freezes that have been implemented leave families unable to afford basic necessities. And both the quantitative and qualitative evidence from the benefit changes in larger families research has found that the benefit cap had a negative impact on parents' mental health. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the people and the individuals that are living in low income. So if you'll indulge me, I'll quote Deneen, who was a participant in the Benefit Changes in Larger Families project, who said, "They're telling me how to live with 3 children off that money, so it causes me worry. Like, even before I get paid, like I know what's going out and I know what's going to be left with. And I know it's going to be a struggle again. It makes you lose everything. Your motivation, your ambition, your mental health. How can I even think about working when I'm constantly feeling ill? I feel sick, and I feel like I haven't been able to do anything that I wanted to do." And Deneen was affected by the 2-child limit. And so there are just many examples of, that highlight the hard work of managing on low incomes when faced with rising costs, the burden of shopping around and going without. You can also point to various statistics that show how poverty is deepening. In 2021-22, there were 6 million people in very deep poverty with an income far below the standard poverty line. And the JRF's Destitution in the UK report shows that around 3.8 million people experienced destitution, where they couldn't afford their basic needs to stay warm, dry, clean, and fed. So, people's incomes are insufficient, and benefit levels aren't, enabling families to meet their needs. And this isn't just a minority issue, because it is worth pointing out that at least 1 family in 4 is entitled to benefits at any one point in time. And over our life course, at least half of us are eligible at some point in time during our life. So, what reforms would I sort of introduce to respond to inequality, increasing levels of poverty and deprivation? So I'm, hopefully sort of convinced you of the power of the benefit system to redistribute income and to reduce poverty by targeting those on low incomes. Now, I think universal credit has a sort of really bad name, in part because of problems in its delivery and some of its features, but ultimately it provides a sort of very good mechanism for getting money to people quickly, and you can use that as a basis on which to uprate benefit levels, which have failed to keep pace with prices in 10 of the last 15 years. Along with wider cuts since 2010, the benefit levels have reduced the income of the poorest fifth by just under £3,000 a year. And so at a minimum, I think benefit levels should be consistently increased with prices to maintain their purchasing power. And the Economy 2030 inquiry, as part of its wider strategy for shared prosperity in the UK, recommends that social security benefits should grow in line with wages rather than prices. I think we should think about the flexibility of the benefit system, and particularly now that we do have universal credit, the ability to respond quickly in times of crisis. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, or its ability to increase incomes during cost of living crisis. I mentioned earlier the issues created by the two-child limit and the benefit cap. So the removal of those would reduce poverty in large families. And it's also worth giving a mention to take-up as well. So well over 10 billion a year of benefits goes unclaimed a year. So you could consider what interventions might ameliorate that. And inevitably there will be concerns about cost and political palatability, and also about work incentives. But I think the concerns about work incentives are overdone in the context of a fast rising minimum wage, and cutting benefits is not the only way to improve work incentives. I mentioned also that there are some specific features of universal credit that do cause hardship. So not only sort of the levels at which benefits are paid, but also various mechanisms within it, the 5-week wait for the first payment of universal credit and the level of debt deductions. So how might you remove the 5-week wait, which causes initial debts, and then subsequently reduce the maximum amount that can be deducted? So now I'd like to sort of move on to what are the wider system changes that might reduce reliance on the benefit system. And here I'm sort of still sticking within the constraints of the benefit system, as to what you might do. It's worth pointing out that compared to most developed nations, the UK's benefit system provides very little income protection against job loss. And this potentially limits workers from taking risks, from leaving one job to move to another, leaving a role if it doesn't work out, or in your inability to have a breathing space in which to find a good match. So, you can compare, there were sort of benefits, comparisons made with sort of Sweden earlier on in the generosity of its benefit system. But if you look at the average replacement rate for unemployment benefits across the OECD, it's 55%. In the UK, a single childless worker on average earnings can expect to receive just 13% of their income, in-work income, when they lose their job. And you don't necessarily have to move to wholesale uplift to the benefit system to achieve higher replacement rates. It might be achieved by paying higher benefits earlier in the jobless spell, or you could think about how you might more closely link initial entitlements to actual expenses. And then I think when you're thinking about the design of the benefit system, that policymakers need to think about the long-term effects of policies. So recent research shows that part-time work does much less than full-time work for career and wage progression. And yet the current benefit system that we have incentivizes part-time work. So, financial credit incentives in tax credits in the 1990s through to the rollout of universal credit, are all about pushing people into work, but into part-time work. And they've had very little effect on increasing, on increasing full-time work. Thinking about the role of conditionality, so imposing job search requirements to get people into work more quickly, that has also been focused on part-time work, and the result has been that most people have moved into part-time and low-earning work, and this brings nothing in terms of longer-term benefits for skills, labour market attachment, or wages. So it's not clear if the current model that we've got is actually worth it in the long run. How do you enable, you have a benefit system that enables people to progress and flourish in work? Right, I'm probably way over time, Jonathan. Right, okay. So, there are also issues with the cost of housing. Perhaps we can come back to that later. It's worth noting the upward trends in long-term sickness and disability and the challenges that creates for the benefit system as well. But I just want to sort of finish with dignity and about remembering that these are people and individuals within the benefit system, and how can you create a system that responds to individuals' complex lives and that takes a people-first approach.
Thank you, Alex. And finally, moving to the sort of other end of it, the tax, in particular tax for those with high levels of wealth and income. We have Arun Advani. Arun is Associate Professor at the University of Warwick. He's also at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but I think in his defense, I would say that he's not responsible for the IFS's output on macroeconomic and fiscal policy issues, as opposed to the tax side. And he's also one of the, a member of the Commission on the Taxation of Wealth. Is it the Taxation of Wealth? And various other bodies relating, studies relating to the, to in particular, wealth tax. And Arun is probably, with his colleague, Andy Summers, who's the co-author of the piece in our report today, as I said before, the country's leading experts on the taxation of wealth and high net worth individuals. So, Arun, over to you.
I guess with that wind up, I should say I speak today on my own behalf and not on behalf of any of the organisations I'm associated with. I thought, given the framing of this session on a fairer, better system, it's useful to point out, just to setting the table here, that you might want to fix the tax system and raise taxes and change things in the tax structure because you want to raise more money. We've heard earlier that there is a case for raising more money to pay for public services and investment and so on. You might also just think we want a better tax system, even if you think that the share of GDP that's taken in tax is the right number. So if you think 37% is the place to be, if you think we should be going down, if you think we should go up, we could still have a better tax system. And so for today, I'll focus on what should we do to make the tax system better, and separately there's a conversation we could have about what the level of that should be and what we want to spend money on. But that's not where I'm intending to go. So I think just kind of touching on Donald's remarks about inequality, I thought I'd highlight an inequality that neither he nor Alex mentioned, which is the people you should really feel sorry for. You should really feel sorry for the bankers. And it's important. I mean, there's a serious point here, which is there are absolutely serious vertical inequalities that people with high levels of income have a disproportionate share of income because they have these high levels of income compared to people further down. That's also true for wealth. But when you look at the tax that's paid, actually even within people at the same level of income, there's a huge variation in what's being paid. So if you're a banker taking home £2 million, you might not be feeling very sorry for this person, but this person is probably paying 47% on their income because they're paying 45% top rate of income tax and they're paying 2% of national insurance contributions. And there are those allowances further down that mean that it's not 47% on everything, but by the time you get to 2 million, those are basically negligible. And so they're paying about 47%. But when you look at people at 2 million, almost a quarter of them are paying a rate that's, a quarter of them paying a rate that's below 20%. 10% of them paying a rate as low as 10%. So that's, the kind of tax rate you'd expect somebody to be paying if they're on the minimum wage. But the reason that they're doing that is because the structure of our tax system, this is not because they're doing anything that's wrong in the sense that they are breaking any rules, is that the structure of our tax system isn't one that taxes all sources of remuneration equally. We tax work much more heavily than wealth. And then even within the taxation of wealth, we tax it in strange and bizarre ways that leave all sorts of gaps. And so that's what I think, where I think we could do some work. And kind of, again, coming back to Jonathan's point at the very top, one particular issue that creates for us is that because we have such an amazingly bad system right now, we can fix it in ways that are fairer and also ways that are better. They're actually good for growth because the current system does not support growth. One of the problems of this point I made about the fact that the actual effective tax rate paid by some of the people at the top is much lower than the rate you imagine if you just look at the headline rates, is that naturally it encourages people, the banker, unfortunately for him or her, can't do anything about it. If you're working for a bank, you really don't have much way of getting out of paying that full tax rate because the bank really wants you to be an employee if you're going to work for them. But if you're a consultant at McKinsey or other consultancies available, you have the option of saying, actually, I'm going to leave this consultancy where the admin and HR and things are done for me, but I'm paying this high tax rate to set up my own individual consultancy. I can be self-employed or I could incorporate and set up my own business. And by doing that, I can, if I'm self-employed, have a lower rate of national insurance contributions. That lowers my tax rate. And, sure, I have to take on a bit more admin, there's a bit more hassle, but maybe it's worth it given the tax break. Or if I incorporate, I actually can pay myself in dividends, which have yet a lower tax rate. Or better still, I could not take the money out of the organisation for as long as I can, delay as much taking payments, take some dividends to kind of get by, and at some point further down the line, I could liquidate the company, and I can take the money out of capital gains tax, and capital gains tax on the first £1 million for this company that I've set up is 10%, after which it would be 20%. So that's clearly much better for me than paying that 47%. And that's bad from the fairness perspective, but it's also bad from the growth perspective. This person could have been an absolutely fantastic consultant working for whoever it was. But instead, because they are getting this massive tax break for restructuring their organization, they're doing something that they know is kind of ineffective. They know this is not the best way to run things because they're not the best person at managing their diary or making sure that the bills are paid and sending off the administrative emails. That's not the bit they're good at. And they might have to find someone who they can contract with to do those things. But that's just not a good use of their time. They could just be specialized in the thing they're really good at. We talked earlier about the long tail of low productive firms. I mean, anyone who's had any work done on their house will know that if you get a builder or a plumber to come in, one, they want to be paid in cash. But two, there's certain times of year that are harder to get them. And it's because in the run up to the tax year, they will look at, okay, well, if I go over £85,000, I'll hit this VAT registration threshold. Maybe I don't really want to take on a lot of new work in March. I could take the month off. Because if I've got close to that cap, actually at this point in the year, it's not great for me. Or, the best way for me to go and do an install for somebody is make sure that they buy the boiler and I'm just paid for the install because that, again, reduces the amount of money coming through my books. These are all inefficiencies that we're all having to live with in the way that we do things. We can't also find, unlike you'd find in other countries, a kind of organization you can go to who's just going to do the plumbing. You go to the individual person because the structure of the tax system is one that encourages people to do these things individually. So this is just to convince you that the tax system is not just bad in the sense that it's unfair, it's bad in the sense that it's inefficient, and it has these impacts on your day-to-day life and onto the day-to-day lives of the people who are doing these things, and that's bad for the overall growth that we have. So with all of that, what has been promised so far? It's not clear what the current government think the strategy for tax is. One example of that is national insurance contributions, which they raised in the form of the health and social care levy, then reduced, except they kept it, then reversed it for dividends so that they kept that bit, and then earlier this month have reduced further. So it's not exactly looking like a strategy. But then when you look at the potential incoming government that may be, if the Labour Party win, the things they've promised so far, which were remarked on earlier, are actually pretty sensible removal of loopholes. They're removing the loophole that means that currently private schools aren't required to pay VAT. On other services that you purchase, you're typically paying VAT, but private schools are currently a service that you can purchase without VAT. They're removing a loophole that means that people who've come to the UK but have some return on income abroad, if it's sufficiently large and therefore they bother to tick a certain box, can not be taxed on that. That's the non-dom benefit that people get. They're potentially removing the benefit that private equity people get relative to people who are working in banks and everybody else, which is that if you work in private equity, you can be taxed as though your return, your actual, what is for everyone else an employment income, is taxed as a capital gain, again, giving you a 20% rate rather than 47%. These are all sensible moves. These are all getting rid of basically unfairnesses in the system that aren't good design issues. They're not going to raise a huge amount of money, so if your goal is to be paying for the various welfare and services and things that people are going to be talking about today or have talked about, you're not going to get a long way down there. But these are all sensible things. But they don't fix the big structural problems in the system. The really big structural problems in the system, I mean, there are many, but just a couple on the personal tax side I think we could go for quite straightforwardly. One is national insurance contributions. The current structure of national insurance contributions is one in which they are a tax, but only on work. So if you earn income from being employed, also if it's being self-employed, although it's a low rate, you're paying national insurance contributions as well as income tax. But if you're working full-time on minimum wage, you're paying that national insurance contribution as well as income tax, and then going home and paying rent to a landlord who's paying income tax on that rent, but isn't paying national insurance contributions. It's hard to rationalize why you would think that's a good design for a system. You could say, well, it's an accident that we got here. We once had an investment income surcharge that meant the income from wealth was taxed more heavily. In 1985, we abolished that, and we took taxation on wealth from a higher level to actually a lower level than on work. And you might think we want to equalize that. One of the effects of doing an equalization like that would also be that it changes these incentives to try to restructure yourself across these boundaries because you're not getting that tax privilege. So it's a good reason to do it from an efficiency standpoint as well as an equity standpoint. Second one that I'll pick up on, and areas I should stop, is on capital gains tax. So in 1988, the absolute radical socialist Nigel Lawson decided that maybe capital gains should be taxed at the same rate as income, with an allowance for inflation. We had that system for 10 years. It worked pretty effectively. We moved away from that, partly because there was the potential idea that taxing capital gains at a lower rate might be good for encouraging investment. We tried that experiment for a good while since then, about 25 years, and we haven't seen that these lower rates are particularly, and also there's now a good body of academic evidence on this. These lower rates haven't been a great way to encourage additional investment, not least because, one, people aren't actually mostly aware of them when they set up companies. There's some nice qualitative work from HMRC showing that. But also because the constraint that people face when they're setting up companies is not, well, it would be great if I got a lower tax rate in 20 years' time when I sell my company if I turn out to be successful. The constraint they face is, I'm trying to invest now and I don't have any money right now. So if you are interested in trying to do something to support entrepreneurship, this is not the way to do it. A pat on the back for the successful people at the end is much less effective than putting in some support at the start when people are investing. So equalizing again capital gains tax rates with income tax rates would be another step towards fixing some of these problems. There are many more problems, and I expect that they'll show up in questions, but I'll leave it there. Those are just the two biggest ones I thought I really wanted to make sure I picked up in my main remarks. Thanks.
Thanks. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, and I've got some on Slido, which I'll begin with before coming to the audience. But since there's one, and it just addresses directly, that came in before, but just directly addresses your last point, Arun, are there any economic, is there any reason for not, either theoretical or practical, for not equalizing CGT, for not going back to the Lawson system of treating income and wealth as the same, with an indexation allowance, obviously so that you don't tax the inflationary gains or the sort of inflation element. And a sort of my own supplementary to that is, given that, is there also an argument for, as I think IPPR proposed, for adding inheritance tax to that? In other words, abolishing inheritance tax and charging it in the hands of the recipient as a capital gain.
So two different points there. So on the evidence for equalising capital gains tax, there's a very interesting theoretical discussion around whether you want an allowance for inflation or for what's called the normal rate of return, which is like the outside option you could have had if you hadn't invested in something risky, but you just bought government bonds or something like that. It is very detailed and quite dry. And for most of the last 25 years, it wouldn't have made a difference. But yeah, last year it would have, because inflation was pretty high and the rate on government bonds was not. I think that inflation is a much easier thing to explain to people why they're getting the tax break for it. That feels more natural to me, but I think you could argue the toss either way, and there are good cases to be made either way around. The evidence on whether lower rates of capital gains tax, I think part of the question here has to be not does a lower rate of capital gains tax encourage additional investment, but does a lower rate of capital gains tax have more of an effect in terms of what additional growth you're going to get than a lower rate of tax on work? Because taxing work is also a bad thing to do from the perspective of encouraging people to work. So given that we need to fund a state, we need to tax work, and we also need to tax wealth. And then the question is there a particular reason to tax wealth more lightly than work? And I think in the context of capital gains, as long as you're having an allowance for either inflation or normal rate of return, the arguments for having a lower rate are pretty weak. On the point about should you abolish inheritance tax and replace it with just taxing capital gains tax, I wouldn't particularly be in favour of that. I think they're doing two very different things. I think there's a case to be made that what you don't want at the moment is what we have, where capital gains tax are just wiped out at death. Because what that means is that if you invested as a, prototypical granny who's got some demutualisation shares and has held on to them for 25 years, and then you actually need to spend that money, you sell those shares, pay capital gains tax on the gain that you got, and then you spend out of the money. And anything you end up having left over at the end, you end up potentially, if you have enough money to also be in the 4% of people, or 5% of people now, paying inheritance tax. You might be paying inheritance tax on that as well. But if you're well off enough that you've got a huge share portfolio that you know you're never going to need to sell, you can carry them over through to the point that you die. The capital gains tax are wiped out. And if you organise and made sure your share portfolio was in AIM shares, then you also aren't having to pay inheritance tax on them either. So the current interaction between inheritance tax and capital gains tax is not a good one. But I think they're serving different functions. The point of capital gains tax is to tax effectively like income the money that you're getting over time. Now, we don't tax it every year as it comes in because you can't touch it every year. We say for practical administrative reasons, we'll just tax it when you sell the asset because that's easier than us trying to work out how much gain you sort of had and taxing you now when you don't have the money yet. But inheritance tax, if you think you want it, is there for a different reason. And it's there, back to this point about social mobility, it's there because we care about how much money is passed on to the next generation. The current design of inheritance tax is not well targeted for dealing exactly with that because it taxes based on the value of the estate, not the amount of money you receive. And it's a good case to move towards something that's taxed more on what you're receiving. But I think the goal of an inheritance tax is certainly very different to the goal of a capital gains tax, and I wouldn't want to replace it one for the other.
Okay. I'll take the most sort of popular question from Slido but slightly rephrase it, which is about the government's sort of assumed plans to cut taxes in the budget. Assuming that the government does indeed cut taxes, what are the sort of general question? What's your view on this? What's compared to the alternatives of spending the money elsewhere, presumably, or indeed reducing borrowing? And if you did spend the money either on taxes and benefits, what would you do? And what should the narrative be around any reductions in tax at this point, either for the government, the opposition, or indeed commentators like us? So we'll give you all a chance to say whatever you want about the sort of current set of choices. Donald, you want to kick off?
Okay, I'll kick off. I mean, this was talked about in the previous session. When we're still running a large public deficit, and adding to the debt, it does seem strange to me to think it's a good time to cut tax. There are many pressing public services and other things that the money could be spent on. Some recommend, some things that some research that I've done in the past around the notion of inclusive growth, trying to identify, working with stakeholders, what sort of policies would help address inequality, but at the same time stimulate economic growth. And there was a few, some of which, maybe not all, but some of which are relatively low-cost policy areas came through that would achieve that. So one was transport, and people were really talking about local transport, in particular bus concessions for young people and enhanced operator subsidies to put services in. Compared to the cost of HS2, that is a drop in the ocean and could help participation in education and all sorts of things. Training, more money to help incentivise employers to participate in apprenticeship schemes was another thing that came through, as was addressing affordability of childcare. And this research that I'm talking about that I was involved with was done before the last spring budget that did announce the significant increase in provision of free childcare, although the pay rates, of course, are perhaps not high enough for it to have as much impact as might be hoped. So there are a number of low-cost things that the money could be usefully directed towards through not cutting taxes now, as well as, of course, the bigger ticket items around NHS and education.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, sort of like Donald and others have been on this panel earlier on. I would not choose to cut taxes at this point. And as Donald's pointed out, there's a huge panoply of things that the money could be spent on, and of course, there are trade-offs amongst all of those decisions. And I really sort of like Donald's approach, which was, what are the lower cost things that you could you could do, because I think you need to think about ways in which you can improve people's lives, whilst taking into account burdens on the taxpayer. And so you can also think, this is not necessarily directly spending the money, but you can also think about how can you improve the jobs that people are currently in through better labour market regulation, enforcement of the minimum wage, increasing flexibility within jobs, because particularly for low-paid workers for whom benefits provide higher replacement rates than sort of middle-income workers. Actually, one thing that the lower-income workers are scared of when they move jobs is losing the flexibility that they had accrued in their previous roles. So, how might making good work would be an appropriate place to focus. I mean, if you look, and then if you're thinking about how would you spend an additional pound within the benefit system? It's been a while. When Jonathan and I were working together, we would run sort of big within the Department for Work and Pensions focused on child poverty. You would be looking for where can you get your biggest bang for your buck. I don't currently have that such a spreadsheet to hand, but I certainly think there is a strong case for getting rid of the two-child limit and the benefit cap, because of the impacts it would have on child poverty.
Arun?
To avoid being boring, I mean, I certainly agree with the points that have been made on the earlier panel, and now that you wouldn't look at the current set of tax and spending plans and say that a tax cut is really what we have space for. But if I'm going to take the premise of the question seriously and say, suppose we just have to do tax cuts, and that's what's going to be, the money's going to be spent on, I think there's then still choices about which taxes you choose to cut. There are taxes that are really bad, that just create bad incentives. So stamp duty is a rubbish tax. It messes up people's ability to move around. It's obviously focused more on, the benefit of that is obviously going to go to a set of people who are affording to buy houses. So it's focused on where in the distribution it's going to go. That may not be what some people on the panel and in the room might like, but if we're thinking about tax cuts as being the thing we're going to do, that's a place you could cut. The national insurance cut that we just did isn't a stupid place to cut taxes. National insurance, as I said, is paid only by workers. So it creates this wedge between the tax on work versus tax on wealth. If you're going to do a tax cut, then reducing the tax on work, especially because the tax cut that just happened on national insurance was only on the rate of national insurance that's between £0 and £50,000. So anyone above £50,000 gets a basically flat amount of money extra they got, and they're not getting an increasing benefit further up the distribution. So that's, again, if you're going to do tax cuts, that's a reasonably sensible thing to do. I'm not sure I would start there, but if we're starting from tax cuts, those are the kind of things I'd look to do. Cut taxes that are actually bad for other reasons anyway.
Okay, I'll take one more and then one or two from the audience, but this one's for you, I think, Arun. How seriously should we take threats that higher tax on those earning most would prompt a mass exodus from the finance sector?
There is really good evidence, I say so myself, on the fact that the finance sector has a huge number of migrants in it. So more than 1 in 5 people who are in the top 1% in finance are migrants to the UK. So in one sense, we should think seriously about whether those people are willing to stay here or not, because there's a lot of people from other countries. On the other hand, the thing that we see when we look at evidence of tax changes for that group is that because of the fact that London actually is a very successful financial sector, has a very successful financial sector, it's the case that people earn much more in finance in London than they would in Paris or Frankfurt or their alternatives. New York is the other place that they can go to, but London, you are actually earning much more. And that's why people actually often come even just on secondment from their French or German bank that is in Frankfurt or Paris or wherever else in the world to come and work in the city. So that means that actually, if anything, economic theory tells you you could, although I'm not actively recommending it, tax them slightly more heavily, because there's actually what we call an agglomeration rent. The sector is very successful, and so you get paid an extra amount for being in finance in London because it's already an especially successful sector, because it feeds off the fact there's this kind of ecosystem around. And there's these additional rents that you could be taxing away. Economic theory would tell you, calculate how much that is, which is a hard thing to do, and tax the rent 100%. That's a very hard thing to do. I'm not sure we'd be able to work out how to do it, so I wouldn't actively recommend we go around trying to figure out how to do that. But I don't think there's good evidence that from where we are, small changes in the tax system are going to lead to migration. I've done work specifically on that question, and we don't see big changes in migration from that kind of effect.
Okay, let me take one from the audience. going right there, over there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Aslan. I'm a technology scientist and an actor currently working on a free universal healthcare service integrating nanotechnology, quantum, AI, and telehealth. So recently, in my interactions with diverse stakeholders, with health ministers, cybersecurity experts, I've highlighted the groundbreaking application of quantum computing. Quantum computing can develop new catalysts.
This has to be a question about the tax and welfare.
We're getting there. To recycle carbon dioxide into clean fuel, create advanced compounds for battery technology, and design proteins for novel disease treatments. And quantum computing can offer solutions.
Okay, question, please.
As AI
What's the question?
related
Sorry,
threat. So the question is,
I'm going to cut you off here. I'm sorry.
Considering the UK challenges with income inequality, social mobility and poverty, how can advancements in these technologies be integrated into reforms of the tax and benefit system and labour markets to address these issues? Could these technologies aid in creating a fairer and more equitable system by providing new economic opportunities and enhancing efficiency and effectiveness of welfare programs?
I'll go to Alex for a very quick response if you want to make one, but I'm not sure there's much.
No, so I think there is something in there about what advancements in society, about technological advancements, green investment. I think there are often hopes that they are going to be the salve to all our wounds. And I think it is always important to look at where the costs and the benefits of these developments fall. So you've got a risk that jobs that are wiped out by technology, and I'm generalizing hugely here, are the low-income jobs. I mean, actually, different research says different things, and so there you actually need a benefit system to protect those that lose their jobs in that scenario. And then I think there's another question you had there about to what extent can we use technologies to improve public services that are delivered. And there, I mean, firstly, I would point to the antiquated systems that certainly legacy benefits still run on. There's a very long.
We've got an excellent chapter by Patrick Dunleavy in the report.
I have read that. Very long way to go there to deliver benefits. And with all of these things, do you have the right data? Who does it advantage and who does it disadvantage? And you just need to be very alert to that.
Okay, last one. Can we take these two right in the front? Ollie, very quickly, one sentence from each of you two.
Yeah, I think you've not touched on the actual issue, and that is the requirement in the UK for there to be this high inequality. Now, the UK is highly dependent on wealthy overseas nationals coming to the UK to live and hopefully then invest in the UK. So how can we remove that dependence on the overseas by changing our tax, not really the welfare, but the tax system, to actually remove that requirement to be dependent on them so highly?
I should be very brief. I come from Germany, where I pay quite a lot of hypothecated taxes. We did mention social care in an earlier session, so I actually also pay a hypothecated tax for social care. I pay a hypothecated tax for health. I pay a hypothecated tax for A, B, and C. Do you have views about roles of hypothecated taxes under a fairer or better system? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, so I'll give each of you a minute or so to answer either or both of those questions as you wish.
I'll say, since time's against us, I'll say something just about the second question. Is something I've thought about in the past and I'm aware of from local taxes in the US are similar. You get a sort of receipt. I'm in favour of a certain degree of hypothecation. I think most people would be in favour of paying more tax for health and social care, but they're not as keen on paying tax in general. But I understand that Treasury wants and needs to maintain a degree of flexibility, particularly in times of crisis. But in general, I'm in favour if it doesn't go too far.
Oh my goodness, I would sort of dispute, the requirement that there has to be high inequality and a sort of reliance on foreign money. So I realise I'm not quite remembering the question correctly. I mean, I think there needs to be the earlier sessions mentioned, what are the UK's strengths, and they're not all dependent on foreign money. There's a sort of high service sector. Our academic here, and we are a small and open economy. So there's inevitably going to be an element of of foreign investment. Indeed, we wouldn't want there to be, but I don't think that is. I would make the sort of direct correlation with high inequality there.
If I were trying to encourage more investment from foreigners in the UK, I'd remove the special tax we currently have that charges a very high rate of tax, about 45%, or actually, depending on how you do it, maybe 30%, on investments that foreigners make in the UK. Because currently what we do is high wealth foreigners, if they come to the UK, can invest abroad at a 0% tax rate, but if they invest in the UK, they pay tax. That's called the remittance basis. It's the benefit that non-doms get. And when you remove it, there's no longer a tax cost to investing in the UK relative to investing abroad. It then becomes invest where I want to invest because that's the thing I want to do, not invest abroad because there's a tax benefit. And so I think doing that would be a totally sensible policy.
The question's not more, but less. Less dependency on overseas. How can we improve this in the UK?
I think we're going to be timed out, but we can talk about it.
Surely it's far more sensible to pay social care than
Well,
and not need it as
we've had the social care question. I mean, I think are we over reliant on foreign? I mean, I think. As Arun has said, a lot of relatively highly paid people in some sectors in London are from abroad. But that doesn't mean we're dependent on their investment as such. It means we're dependent on them as providers of labour, of relatively highly skilled labour. And as Alex said, that's is sort of a structural feature of a small open economy with a large, highly productive tradable services sector. And I think, the question is not how to, and there's some stuff on this in particular in Henry Overman's paper in the report. The question is not how to shrink this sector because it is good for the UK as a whole and certainly good for tax revenues and the provision of public services, but how you spread some at least of the benefit of that success to other particularly large conurbations so that you can have productive sectors in areas of the country which currently don't have the same degree of large productive firms and the agglomeration effects from which London benefits. So that wouldn't be about discouraging people from coming, or including relatively well-off or skilled people from coming here, but how you get some of those centres of agglomeration benefits elsewhere in the country, which currently we lack, and which is one of the reasons why we're overall not nearly as rich or an equal country as we could be. So with that, I think I'll bring it to a close. Obviously, plenty more to discuss, and I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but thanks very much indeed to the three panellists. And hope